Welcome to Off the Clock, the webcast of employment attorneys at Miller Johnson, where we discuss what is happening in the HR world and provide practical insight and advice.
Welcome to Off the Clock. This is Rebecca Strauss with Miller Johnson. Sarah Willie could not join me today, so I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Sandy Andre. For those that have watched the show before, you'll notice we're doing something a little different. We're not in the same room. We're doing this by Zoom because we record in Michigan. We have three offices, Detroit, Grand Rapids, and Kalamazoo. Sandy and I are not in the same office, and the road made it frankly impossible for us to record together today. So we decided to still record, but do it by Zoom. So we hope that you all enjoy today's episode about workplace romances, just in time for your Valentine's Day. Hi, Sandy.
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so glad, and I'm so excited that we get to talk about this together, because your marriage is a product of an office romance, isn't it?
It is. Disclaimer. Speaking from a chair of experience.
And you're married and have a wonderful, beautiful family, so it all worked out.
That's right. It was not one of these romances that went bad, so that we're going to talk about today.
And I understand from the statistics that you have that you are not alone. You and your husband were not alone in having an office romance, or having a romance that began in the workplace, right?
Yeah, that's right. So SHRM actually did a survey about office romances about a year or so ago. And what they found by the folks who responded to that survey is over a third of responders said that they're currently in or have previously been involved in an office romance. And more interestingly, 3 out of 4, so 75% of the people who did respond said they'd be totally comfortable if they had a colleague or two colleagues in the workplace who were involved in an office romance. So kind of the takeaway, right, is people are involved in office romances, and the rest of the people who aren't don't care, right? No, they don't care. They don't mind it, and wouldn't mind if their employers required them to disclose those office romances. But again, about 3 out of 4, 75% of the responders said their organizations do not currently have a policy that requires disclosure. So I thought that was really interesting.
So 75% of folks don't care if people in their workforce are dating.
Yep.
So why do we care? We'll go through the list as to why employers might want to care, but I'll just remind folks how we come up with these show topics in the first place. When we get a series or a number of the same types of calls, questions, issues that HR is struggling with in the workplace, we think something might be going on, right? Some news, something is happening in the universe that is causing a problem to arise, or we think there is an issue that HR needs support on, right? That employers need support on. And we had a whole series of calls from clients with questions about workplace romances, some that were ongoing, some that had ended, but they did cause some concern amongst HR folks. So let's talk about why, right? Why did we get the calls here at Miller Johnson? I'll start us off, and then you can talk about some of your own experiences with clients, Sandy. One that comes up quite often is conflicts of interest. This particularly comes up when there's a reporting relationship, and not even necessarily a direct reporting relationship, but a difference in power level within the organization. And then there's a decision to be made about a promotion or a demotion, or who gets to go to a certain conference, who gets to be transferred and who doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. And when there's a relationship, or often a relationship that has ended, and these decisions are made, there is a feeling sometimes amongst one of the persons in the former relationship that the former relationship caused that decision to be made. There's perception amongst coworkers, right? Even if the relationship is ongoing, that is the relationship, right, that caused the boss right, to make that decision. And just more generally, from a business perspective, like any conflict of interest, decisions may not be getting made based on what is best for the business, right? Decisions might be getting made for someone's personal interest and not the business interest. So we certainly get calls and questions and concerns when that sort of situation arises. How else have you seen businesses be impacted by workplace relationships?
Yeah, and to piggyback off what you just said, right? These relationships kind of put a cloak of questioning almost over lots of organizational decisions, right? And so even if you are in the workplace relationship and you do get promoted, right? You might even question, right? Was that on my own merits? Did this relationship have something to do with it? In addition to all of your colleagues giving you the side eye and wondering those things too. So kind of just this cloak of questioning over those types of business decisions, quite frankly, right? These relationships can also be distracting, right? If you have ever been in a workplace where folks are in a workplace relationship and in a meeting, sometimes right, we've got differences of opinion. This has happened to me. You sit there and you think, I feel like I am in marriage counseling with these people because I'm seeing, right? I think someone didn't take out the trash the right way this morning, and that is spilling over into, right, this conversation about, right, a work decision, a workplace issue, a business decision. And that just leads to a level of discomfort, quite frankly, of everyone in the room who's involved in those conversations, right? Kind of this layer of this unspoken uncomfortableness that can really distract from some of the business decisions that the organization is trying to make. There's also these bigger legal issues, right, Rebecca? And what are some of those?
Yeah. So what we've been talking about so far are, right, they're definitely issues, but from a legal standpoint, right, every once in a while we get called for legal advice, sometimes other kinds of advice. But from a legal standpoint, of course, it's harassment, right? Employers are concerned. Not just that they will have an allegation of harassment, but more fundamentally that there might be harassment going on, and no one wants to perpetuate that. So even when both parties in a relationship in the moment say it's consensual, sometimes after a breakup, people may say something different. So that is a legal risk after a breakup is typically when the risk comes into play, but sometimes even during a relationship, it might not be consensual. There is a school of thought out there now that the courts have not picked up on quite yet, but it's been made by litigants, so we'll see, about when there's a significant enough power differential rather, between two members in a relationship that it can never really be consensual. Again, the courts have not approved that theory quite yet, but we've seen expert witnesses, for instance, being introduced, talking about that theory. And then, Sandy, unfortunately, there's also potential for workplace violence when there's a nasty breakup, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know, right, previous episodes of Off the Clock did it, right, a two-part series specifically about workplace violence. And what we know about workplace violence is, right, a majority of workplace violence incidents are kind of flow from romantic relationships that aren't going so well. So, right, that's not necessarily particular to two people being in the same workplace, but that's kind of an overarching and overlay, right? What do you do if you have one employee who, right, things really didn't end well, and right, a personal protective order against the other, and how do you harmoniously continue to work in the workplace, right? Those are extreme examples, but right, just remind us about all of kind of the prevention and protection pieces that go along with being fully prepared for keeping our workplaces safe.
Right. And just to be clear from a legal perspective, because we are lawyers. So every once in a while, people want to know what we think as lawyers. You can have a policy that prohibits romantic relationships between coworkers at all levels. And I know some companies do. And what we're saying is it might not be the best option. The approach that I like is with office romances, and frankly, with anything, I apply this approach to lots and lots of different workplace situations, is we're busy. We don't want to get involved in your personal life. But when your personal life affects our business, then it becomes our business. Right. That's kind of when it crosses the line. And when we do take an interest, and workplace romances, when you're dating someone in the office, it has the potential to impact our business. So then we start taking an interest.
I think about workplace romances and the way that from an organizational perspective, you maybe want to think about managing that or evaluating the impact, right? Taking a look at maybe your existing conflict of interest policies and thinking about, oh, I hadn't really thought about how this would apply to a workplace romance type of situation, but you've already got some structures in place to say, hey, employees, if you, right, are engaged in something where your, right, personal engagement with that could impact your decision making, or might look like it's impacting your decision making, or impact the way you do your job, right? We ask that you raise your hand and disclose that, and then the company will work with you to evaluate whether it's an apparent conflict of interest or something like that. So trying to think about managing workplace relationships kind of with that same type of structure, particularly, right, if you're not going to have a policy that's an all-out prohibition on workplace romances. Exactly.
Let's talk about policies. Can we do that? You're a former HR professional, right, Sandy?
I love my policies.
I know you do. And so many of our clients and listeners do too. One, as you already mentioned, might just be disclosure.
Yep.
Right? And naming the person that the disclosure should be made to. In the policy, we're going to make sure we talk about privacy. Mm-hmm. Right. If we're going to require disclosure, we cannot be engaged in office place gossip. It's hard, people. It's hard. But we really have to restrain ourselves and consider it akin to medical information. And if the people in the relationship want to tell their colleagues, fine.
Yeah, I think if you're going to have a policy and you're not going to prohibit wholesale, I think what you absolutely need in that policy is a prohibition on relationships between supervisors and direct reports, right? Okay. It doesn't mean that two people who are today in those positions can't start a relationship, but minimally there's got to be a mechanism to say, okay, once you engage in that relationship, we as a company need to reshuffle the deck and figure out how to not have that superior subordinate relationship, right? And I've seen some policies that take a couple of different approaches with respect to reporting relationships. Some are more narrow, right? If I have a team of 5 people as an example, okay, Sandy, right, you can't be engaged in a workplace romance with any of those 5 people, right? But if I'm an executive, right, if I'm the CEO, or if I'm a very high level position, the reality is lots and lots of people report to me, particularly if I'm the CEO, maybe everybody reports to me, right? So we talked about maybe the policy isn't a prohibition across the board, but you want to think about it, right? Because it's really important to prohibit, right, the superior subordinate relationship. And there are some positions in the company that's everybody. And so, right, a disclosure requirement, a prohibition about that reporting relationship that kind of triggers a mechanism to what I kind of call reshuffle the deck. Okay, who do we have a mechanism to reassign one of you? Is one of you going to voluntarily resign? If there's an open position, can we slot you into it? Do we give you a period of time to try to say, yep, I'm qualified for that position and I can move to that position? And if we haven't found a place for people to land, the company gets to decide which of the 2 of you is going to leave the company, right? You need to think a little bit about all of those things. You don't necessarily have to put pen to paper on every specific detail, as much as my former HR self would love for you to have every single detail written out. But as you're crafting a policy, if you're going to have one, I think you want to think about how those things would play themselves out.
Let's talk about some other points that we might want to make in a policy, and then we'll go on to talk about organizations that have formal agreements. A good policy prohibits public displays of affection, right? For obvious reasons, it makes coworkers uncomfortable or has the potential to. And a policy should also very explicitly state the company's prohibition on any kind of harassment, quid pro quo, hostile work environment, et cetera, to make sure that it's understood by all that will not be tolerated. So with the general policy in mind, let's talk about formal agreements. We used to call them love contracts. I'm not sure if people still use that phrase. They were very popular for a while and then fell kind of out of fashion. And I think there's a resurgence. I don't know if it's because of the Me Too movement.
I always think when I hear this, right, there's a couple of pretty funny episodes of The Office with Michael and Jan and the love contract and needing to sign it and then tear it up and sign it again. So yes, for sure. And so, yeah, like you said, Rebecca, they were kind of in vogue and went away and kind of a resurgence, right? And I think the idea is for everybody to get on the same page, at least at one point in time, right at the very beginning, or whenever the organization has come to learn about this relationship, that everyone's on the same page, that at least it's initiating as a consensual relationship. Right?
Both people in the relationship sign it. It acknowledges that the relationship is consensual, that there will be no impact on either one's job should the relationship be sustained, or should there be a breakup, non-retaliation, again, a restatement of the harassment policy and all of that, right? And then both sides sign off on that. And then oftentimes there's a requirement that the members of the relationship contact HR when it ends, right? Because oftentimes that's where the rubber hits the road, if you will, when it comes to legal liability. Now, one of my favorite topics is do we allow people to ask each other out? Okay, we're not going to fire people if they're engaged in relationships, as long as there's not a reporting relationship. But what do we do about how do we ask people out? Are we allowed to? Or every time I ask someone out, is that automatically harassment, a violation of the company's harassment rules? And one of the approaches I have really come to like is a one ask policy, right? Where everyone gets one ask. You could ask someone out once, and if they say no, or if they ghost you, which I understand from my kids is really how it goes these days. If you ask someone out and get no response or an ambiguous response, anything other than a yes, you don't get to ask again. Right? Because eventually, since you only get one Sandy, you better make it a good one.
Yes. Yeah. That's
Rent
right.
a white horse and ride into the office, hire a band to sing a love song, whatever you want to do to get that yes. But caveats, make it an ask you would make in front of your mother and grandmother, right?
Right.
An ask is not anything that includes foul language, right? Or sexual language, or talks about body parts. And as I told my kids when they were little, use your words.
Right. That's right.
An ask is always a written or verbal ask. It is never a touch. Okay, well, this was super fun, Sandy. This is a little Valentine's gift to all of our listeners and viewers, right?
Yes. And again, I think, right, a timely topic, right? As you said, Rebecca, you've gotten lots of calls in this space recently. And again, I just go back to the statistics, right? That so many of us have or are engaging in workplace romances, and right, kind of couple that with we spend the most time, right? Where do you spend the most time? Maybe even more time than you do with your family and at your house, right? It's at work with people that you work with, right? So, right, that kind of becomes your community of people, right? And so, Rebecca, you talked about you haven't dated in 30 years. I haven't dated in almost 20 years. Pre-interwebs, right? People do meet people all different ways now, right? But way back in the day, that's right. It was wherever your community was, right? And so the organization is just one more little community. And so it makes sense for employers to think about the approach they want to take to this.
Agree. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sandy. This was a ton of fun. happy Valentine's Day to you and your husband who met at work.
That's right. Happy Valentine's Day.
Bye-bye.